All right, folks. So we had a test yesterday in large group. I got to give this week's large group here in small group, okay? So let's go ahead, take a second, get your AirPods out, all that good stuff, okay? Don't want to see them in or else you're going to get written up. So we are moving on. And we are going to start talking about the Cold War, specifically kind of the early part of the Cold War here today. Here are your objectives, okay? So go ahead, start writing those down. By the end of this lecture, I hope that you can understand the causes of the Cold War and the Korean War. And I also want you to understand how world regions affected early stages of the Cold War. I'm going to give you just about a minute to write these down, then we got to move on. About 20 more seconds here. All right, I got to move on. So, before we get into talking about the Cold War, we need to understand how does this Cold War get started? What are the origins of the Cold War? All right? Post World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union, sometimes I'll refer to the Soviet Union as the USSR, they emerge as the two leading world superpowers. They also have competing fundamental ideologies that push their societies forward. Okay, the United States is committed to capitalist principles that are established in which private citizens control almost all economic activity, whereas the USSR, the Soviet Union, they are committed to the system of communism, where the state controls all property and economic activity. Okay? You guys remember hearing about the Yalta and Potsdam conferences a couple weeks ago? Mr. Brosek mentioned these conferences where the Allied powers are trying to figure out what to do with post-war Europe. Okay? Specifically, by the time of the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945, Joseph Stalin breaks his promise that he had given to President Roosevelt at the Yalta Conference that he was going to let countries in Eastern Europe that the Soviet Union had taken over during World War II hold free and fair elections. Okay? What happens is Stalin starts to basically institute communist puppet governments in these different countries like Poland and Ukraine, countries like that in Eastern Europe. And so these countries are basically run by the Soviet Union after World War II. In early 1946, Stalin gives a speech where he talks about how capitalism and communism are fundamentally opposed to each other. They cannot coexist peacefully together. And Stalin predicts that there is going to be another war fought in the wake of World War II, now that the Soviet Union and the United States are the two world superpowers, and they both have very different ideologies about how to best run a country, govern a country. Okay? So American foreign policy really is shaped around this growing threat of the Soviet Union and a fear of a spread of communism. We're going to talk about that here just a little bit. The Truman Doctrine, named after President Harry S. Truman, okay, that's who's pictured there. In a speech that he delivers to a joint session of Congress in March of 1947, he asks Congress to appropriate $400 million in economic and military aid for the countries of Greece and Turkey. He asks Congress to do this in an effort to help those countries resist growing communist influence in the region. This Truman Doctrine, which is kind of the name that we give to Truman's foreign policy, dealing with these communist nations, a country like the Soviet Union, established the position that the United States would provide political, military, and economic assistance to all democratic nations under threat from external or internal authoritarian forces. I'm going to repeat that because that's a very important definition for you to take down. The very heart of this Truman Doctrine establishes the position that the United States would provide political, military, and economic assistance to all democratic nations perceived to be under threat from communism. This Truman Doctrine effectively reoriented U.S. foreign policy away from its usual stance of withdrawal from regional conflicts and instead moves the United States into more of an interventionist mindset when it comes to getting involved with these countries under the perceived threat of maybe communism is likely to spread there, take over there. Within the larger framework of the Truman Doctrine, there are a couple different theories that come about. One of the most important theories concerning U.S. foreign policy is what we call domino theory. Okay, y'all have probably played the game of dominoes before where you set them all up and you knock one over and then it proceeds to have a chain reaction, the rest of them topple over, right? That's kind of the picture that I want you to have in your mind when you think about domino theory. First talked about by the Undersecretary of State, Dean Acheson. Basically, what Acheson was saying is that if countries like Greece and Turkey were to fall to communism, it would not be long before other countries in that same region of the world also fell to communism. I'll repeat that again. Domino theory is the belief that if one country falls to communism, neighboring countries would be soon to follow. I can't state this enough. Domino theory becomes one of the most integral pieces that guides American foreign policy over the course of the rest of the 20th century. For the next 35, 40-ish years, the concept of this domino theory is going to guide decisions made at the highest levels of the federal government concerning relations with other countries and really dictates what we do as a country as far as foreign policy is concerned. Your next big key theory that also goes along with foreign policy during the early Cold War is this theory of containment. Okay, this gentleman in the bottom right, George F. Kennan, It's an American diplomat who is credited with first coming up with this conception of containment. So, what is containment? The main goal or purpose of containment theory is to keep communism from spreading beyond where it already exists. So you can see how something like domino theory and containment kind of go hand in hand. Okay? If a country is to fall and be taken over by a communist regime, Kennan, through this containment theory, advocates that the United States needs to figure out how to keep it isolated in just that one country. It cannot spread any further than that one country that's already fallen. Otherwise, you're going to get the effects of the domino theory. Okay, so you see how these two policies go hand in hand with each other. Containment provides a conceptual framework for a series of initiatives undertaken during the Truman presidency to halt attempts by the Soviet Union to expand. And we'll learn about a couple of those here later in lecture. We good on domino theory and containment? We understand these two really key pieces of Truman's foreign policy? Okay. Another piece of American foreign policy that becomes extremely popular during this early Cold War period is what we call the Marshall Plan. Okay, this gentleman on the right-hand side, George C. Marshall, formerly the Chief of Staff for the U.S. Army during World War II. During the first part of the Truman administration, he is nominated as Secretary of State. So in June of 1947, George Marshall called for the United States to piece together a comprehensive program to rebuild Europe. Post-World War II, Europe was in really, really rough shape, okay? You had millions of people that were living in refugee camps while European governments struggled to figure out how to get these displaced people back to their homes. It is really, really a mess, okay? So Marshall is advocating that the United States has a role to play in helping rebuild post-war Europe. So Truman followed up on Marshall's suggestion and asked Congress to allocate funds to provide economic aid to Europe. Okay, that's the big thing that you need to know about the Marshall Plan. It's going to provide economic aid to Europe. Over the next 4 years, from 1947 to 1951, Congress appropriated $13.3 billion for European recovery. So the Marshall Plan provides American goods to these war-torn European countries. It created reliable trading partners between these countries and the United States. And it also showed these countries American goodwill, right? In this ideological battle that's going to emerge during the Cold War of capitalism versus communism, you have the United States committed to capitalist principles giving these war-torn European nations tons of economic aid. Well, who do you think these European nations are going to then ally with later on down the road if there's a conflict? Probably the United States, okay? So there is a motive, there's also kind of a diplomatic motive within the larger framework of the Marshall Plan as well, okay? So communism loses much of its appeal to voters in Western Europe as a result of the economic aid supplied by the Marshall Plan. Okay, so we kind of have our framework for American foreign policy that is going to guide us through the early stages of the Cold War. But like with all policies, domestic and foreign, you don't know if they are going to work until they're put to the test. Okay? one of the very first real crises that emerges from this early Cold War era is what we call the Berlin conflict. So, reminder, post-World War II, Germany was broken up into 4 occupation zones. This is part of what they decided at that Yalta conference, okay? The Americans would control a zone, the British would control a zone, the French would control a zone, and the Soviet Union would control a zone. By 1948, the United States, Britain, and France agreed to merge their 3 zones into what we would eventually call West Germany. The Soviet Union held on to their zone, and that zone became East Germany. And within East Germany is the capital city of Berlin. Berlin, the city, was also divided between the West and the East. So within the big enclave of Soviet Union-controlled East Germany is this capital city of Berlin, the western part governed by the Allies, and the eastern part governed by the Soviet Union. So the people that are living in West Berlin are really, really reliant on the Allied nations, US, Great Britain, and France, to provide them with aid in all sorts of facets, okay? As the wartime alliance between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union turned hostile, the question of whether the Western occupation zones in Berlin would remain under Western Allied control or whether the city would be absorbed into Soviet-controlled Eastern Germany led to this crisis, okay? Crisis begins in June of 1948. Joseph Stalin and Soviet forces decide that they are going to blockade all rail, road, and water access to Allied-controlled areas of Berlin. So Stalin is going to try to gain the upper hand a little bit. He is going to block all access to West Berlin, to the Allies. So the Allies are not able to get any sort of food, equipment, supplies into West Berlin via roads or rail. As a result, the approximately 2.1 million citizens of West Berlin had only enough food to last 5 weeks. Okay, so there is a big time crisis that is going to unfold here if the Allies don't piece together a plan to solve this issue and beat the blockade. Okay, so we are going to learn a little bit more about the solution that the Allies come up with in this situation.
1948, Berlin. Relations between Western Allies and the Soviet Union take a turn for the worse. In June, Soviet forces block access to Allied-controlled areas. The Russians want the entire city under communist control. It's the first international crisis of the Cold War. World War III is a very real threat. As the months go on, the situation gets worse. The Soviets appear to have the upper hand. Then the Allies come up with a novel plan. Airlift, food, milk, coal, gasoline. West Berliners need 35,000 tons of these supplies every single day. An airlift this big has never been done. The Soviets bet it never will. The Allies' plan gets off to a rocky start. Enter General William Tunner. Using a fleet of 225 C-54s, he hatches a plan to outsmart the Soviets. Tunner's airlift drops 2.3 million pounds of supplies. 11 months later, the Soviet Union lifts the blockade. Its stranglehold on West Berlin defeated. In the Air Force, fighters and bombers are the shakers, but transport aircraft are the movers.
So, if you can't get there via road or rail, take it to the skies. And that's exactly what the Allies decide to do. It's what we call the Berlin Airlift, okay? This is an amazing, innovative feat that the Allies come up with. Over 327 consecutive days, planes operated continuously, completing 277,000 flights, delivering 2.3 million tons of food, fuel, medicine, and even Christmas gifts to the citizens of West Berlin. Okay? This airlift is, I can't overstate its impact. It ensured the survival of the citizens of West Berlin, and it also demonstrated the Allies' commitment to resisting Soviet pressure and communist threats of aggression in this region. So the crisis does conclude on May 11th, 1949. The Soviet Union decides to lift the blockade of West Berlin. This event really does solidify kind of this demarcation between Western democratic Germany and Eastern communist-controlled Germany. Okay? Later on in the semester, we'll learn about something called the Berlin Wall, right? This divider that signifies that demarcation in the city of Berlin, but that's another story for another time, okay? The success of this Berlin airlift really boosted American prestige worldwide as well, okay? So you can see on that map right there the different flight patterns that these transport planes would take into Berlin. They would literally touch down. People would be on board these big transports, like unloading the cargo really, really quickly, and then they're taking off. And they would touch down and take off about every 20 to 25 minutes. These planes were coming in. Okay, like I said, amazing, amazing feat. Out of this Berlin crisis comes something that really shapes the way that these nations, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union, are going to deal with each other going forward. I want you to take a listen to this video.
The guns of World War II had barely cooled when a new conflict threatened to rock Europe. This time around, it was the Western democracies, like Great Britain and France, and their ally across the pond, the United States, versus the Soviet Union and its communist satellites. These two sides each formed their own security agreements to show they meant business. These were NATO and the Warsaw Pact. After the war, the Soviet Union began to flex its muscles, installing communist governments in Eastern Europe. In 1948, the USSR toppled a democratic government in Czechoslovakia and then cut off supply routes to West Berlin. The United States and its Western European allies began to get nervous. Do you see what's going on over there with the Soviets? We don't like that, okay? In April 1949, foreign ministers of a dozen Western European and Northern American nations met in Washington, D.C. to sign the North Atlantic Treaty. This created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. In Article 5 of the treaty, NATO nations agreed that an attack against any of them by, say, the Soviet Union, for example, would be an attack against all of them. Original NATO nations sound off. Belgium, Denmark, Great Britain, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, Canada, and the United States. Greece and Turkey joined in 1952, and West Germany in 1955. It was West Germany that made things a little tense. The US and its allies wanted to let West Germany form its own army, but the USSR wasn't psyched about this. The Soviets warned that if West Germany did raise an army and join NATO, they'd make their own alliance. West Germany did join NATO, so the Soviet Union said, okay, we told you so. In May of 1955, it gathered its communist allies in Eastern Europe and sat them down for a good old treaty signing. That treaty was the Warsaw Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance, or the Warsaw Pact. They called it the Warsaw Pact because it was signed in, wait for it, Warsaw. Warsaw Pact nations roll call. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, Albania, East Germany, Bulgaria, and the Soviet Union. In 1968, Albania left the pact as the country became more closely aligned with Communist China. Like NATO, Warsaw Pact member nations were bound to come to each other's defense if attacked by an outside power. It also established a central military command, putting the Soviet Union firmly in charge. The Soviet Union also used the pact to keep its members in line. Popular uprisings in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland were all squashed by the Soviets. NATO and the Warsaw Pact. These were the players in the Cold War, facing down each other like two wary nuclear-armed gunfighters, each waiting for the other to flinch and knowing that war between them might mean the end of the world. And they would stay that way till 1991. When the Soviet Union disbanded, so too did the Warsaw Pact.
All right, so that gives you some pretty good information on these kind of post-World War II alliances that are created, okay? You can see on that map on the right-hand side, the darker blue nations, those are the ones that are original members of NATO. Those dark red nations are the original members of the Warsaw Pact, okay? And so really the big takeaway that I want you to understand about NATO is that in the NATO Charter, these member nations state that if one of us is attacked, the rest of the members have a responsibility to come to that nation that's been attacked's defense. Okay? So if France is attacked by the Soviet Union, it is up to the rest of the members of NATO to come to the defense of France and repel the Soviet Union in their aggression. Okay? Get them out of France. And you could see you see how this West Germany and East Germany really ratchets up the tension between Western European nations, the United States, and these Eastern European nations, specifically the Soviet Union. Because West Germany later joins NATO in 1955, the Soviet Union says that they are going to form an alliance, the Warsaw Pact. And it basically says the same thing as NATO. Okay? Another test of American foreign policy is when, in 1949, China falls to communism. So China had been engaged in a civil war since the 1920s, but it really intensified after World War II, okay? Top picture on the left-hand side, that gentleman, his name was Chiang Kai-shek. He was the leader of the nationalist Chinese government. The gentleman on the right was the leader of the communist movement or communist rebellion in China that was trying to get Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government out of power. Okay, his name was Mao Zedong. As you can maybe guess, the U.S. during this whole civil war between the Chinese Communist Party and the nationalist government of China, the U.S. supported Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. The Soviet Union supported Mao Zedong and his premier Zhou Enlai and supported the Chinese Communist Party. Civil War really picks up starting in 1946. The Chinese Communist Party had a stronger support in rural areas of China, and they also had a superior military strategy, and they gained the upper hand during the later part of the 1940s. Okay, so in 1949, after a series of communist victories, Mao Zedong establishes the People's Republic of China, and China has now fallen to communism. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist forces are exiled to Taiwan. U.S. really struggled with the political fallout of China falling to communism. Okay, this is their big fear, right? If one nation falls, we have to figure out how to contain it, and we also don't want one nation falling to communism to spill out into other nations, creating the effects of that domino theory that we talked about earlier. So many feared that the principles of this domino theory were set to play out in Asia as hostilities between the U.S. and the People's Republic of China escalated as the 50s got underway. The Korean War is one of the best examples from this time period of the United States really putting their foreign policy to the test. So after World War II, Korea was divided at what we call the 38th parallel. Okay, 38th parallel runs about right in the middle of the Korean Peninsula. The northern part is supported by the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. Okay, they're communist. The southern portion is bolstered by the United Nations. Okay, so more democratic in nature. In June of 1950, North Korea invades the southern portion of Korea. Okay, the United Nations condemns the attack and called for military support to defend Korea. And like I said, many Americans viewed this new outbreak of hostilities in a place like Korea as putting their containment policy to the test, right? Is this country, the whole country of Korea, going to fall to communism? Or is the U.S. going to contain communism to the Soviet Union and China where it already exists? Okay. So initially, North Korean forces push the United Nations forces all the way down to the southern portion of the peninsula. Okay, they have to regroup at a city called Pusan. Douglas MacArthur, who you might remember from our World War II lecture, he is leading the U.S. Army in Korea at this time, and he puts together a strategy that enables the UN forces to push back northward. And you can see by November of 1950, they're pushing up into the northernmost portions of North Korea and getting close to the North Korea-China border. MacArthur pushed for even more aggressive action. He actually wanted to go and invade China. He advocated for use of nuclear weapons against China, against communist nations. And because he and Harry Truman got into a lot of disagreements, and MacArthur was going on record saying some of these outlandish things, like we should be using nuclear weapons against China and against the Soviet Union, President Truman eventually removes him from command. Okay? Eventually, North Korean forces push the UN forces back down after MacArthur's removal, and a stalemate ensues, starting in the summer of 1951. And that is exactly where the Korean War really ends. Okay, it ends back where it began at the 38th parallel. The war ended in 1953 with an armistice. No formal peace treaty was ever signed. The war reinforced U.S. commitment to containing communism in Asia and led to increased military spending. Okay, this is the start of the United States getting heavily involved against communist nations in Southeast Asia. We'll talk about Vietnam later this semester. It's the same principle. Okay, Korean War really does set a precedent for future Cold War conflicts involving U.S. military intervention.